This week I want to start with a little bit of group participation. Go ahead and clear your mind. I'm going to say one word, and I want you to say your immediate response out loud, if you can. Okay, got your mind clear? Here it goes. Chaos. Maybe you said something like Facebook or traffic, but I'm willing to bet that you did not say the word marathon. But that might be more appropriate of a word association than you would expect. My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. Marathons were born out of chaos, literally. In 490 BCE, the Greeks and Persians faced off in a bloody battle on the shores of the Aegean Sea. At the start of the battle, the Greeks and the Persians stood facing each other merely 1,500 meters apart. They began slowly inching their way forward, like two boxers in a ring trading flinches, just waiting for the first jab to be thrown. The Mediterranean air must have been heavy with the tension of expectation. The Greeks made the first move, marching in a battalion of warriors to the center of the battlefield. However, this was merely a trap, and the Persians took the bait. After goading the Persians into charging, the Greek battalion turned and ran back to their original position. Then, once the Persians were within range, two previously unseen Greek forces surrounded the Persian charge, flanking them on both sides. It was a massacre. Blood and body parts mingled with the sand as the Greeks, with the assistance of the Athenians and Spartans, routed the Persians back to their ships in retreat. Some of the Persians were so desperate to get away from the Greek armies that they fled directly into the swampland and perished there in the muck on foreign soil. When the fog of war had cleared, it was recorded by Greek chronicler Herodotus that 6,400 Persian bodies were recovered by the Greek, while Greek losses were less than 200. The Greeks had won the Battle of Marathon in a shutout, and in the fray there was one hero who gave his life for the cause, but not in the way you're imagining. Legend has it that a trained runner named Philippides was sent from Marathon to Sparta to request their assistance, on a journey that spanned 150 miles and took about 2 days. He then fought in the Battle of Marathon, and upon sensing Persian retreat he was sent to Athens. He made the 26-mile run in a matter of hours, stripping his weapons, armor, and clothing along the way to increase his speed and endurance. Philippides burst into Athens and shouted, "We win!" Then collapsed dead in the street, completely naked. Naturally, there is a great deal of argument over whether or not this literally happened. I mean, it's plausible. Day runners were a perfectly normal form of communication at the time, but then again, it's also possible that this is a bit of an embellishment. Regardless, the story of Philippides' big run spread throughout the world and gained a lot of artistic attention. In addition to inspiring some very beautiful paintings, the story caught the attention of English poet and playwright Robert Browning, who crafted this lovely verse about Philippides in 1879. So when Persia was dust, all cried to Acropolis, "Run, Philippides, one race more, the meed is thy due. Athens is saved, thank Pan, go shout!" He flung down his shield, ran like fire once more, and the space twixt the fennel field and Athens was stubble again, a field which a fire runs through. Till in he broke, "Rejoice, we conquer!" Like wine through clay, joy in his blood, bursting his heart, the bliss. Moved by the legend of Philippides, as well as the accompanying art and verse, Pierre de Coubertin invented a new kind of track and field race to honor the ancient Greek hero. If you haven't guessed yet, they called this race the Marathon, and its distance is roughly 26 miles, to simulate Philippides' run to Athens. That's the chaotic soup that the marathon race was born out of, and ever since it just seems to be a magnet for mayhem. Weirdly, many people face the same fate as Philippides. Some estimates suggest that anywhere from 1 to 2 participants per 100,000 will die competing. Admittedly, that's less than the number of boxers who have died in the ring, but still, when considering that over 500,000 people participated in marathons in 2016 alone, that ratio begins to be worrisome. In the US, the shadow of the Boston Marathon bombings still looms overhead, and more recently in China, a miscalculation of the conditions led to the death of 21 participants in the Gansu Ultramarathon. If I were superstitious, I might believe that marathons are cursed or something. Tragedy aside, there was one Olympic marathon that, despite starting with very strong potential, ended up being one of the most entertaining and outrageous stories in sports history. In 1904, St. Louis, Missouri was the place to be. It was the centennial celebration of the Louisiana Purchase, and for the occasion, St. Louis hosted the World's Fair. And, as the World Fair was known for, the event introduced the world to many new and exciting inventions. By the time it was done, over 19 million people from across the world had visited the exposition to see early versions of the wireless phone, the fax machine, the X-ray machine, the private automobile, and even Dr. Pepper. Interestingly enough, the 1904 World's Fair also hosted the 1904 Olympic Games, but before I open Pandora's box, we need to pay some bills, so we're going to take a quick, about minute-long break, and then we're going to jump right back into the story. On August 30th, 1904, 32 runners lined up to start the biggest marathon of their lives. The assortment of runners was diverse. Among them was American Sammy Mellor, who was one of the favorites to win. The New Yorker had already won a Boston Marathon and placed in 3 others by the time he made his Olympic debut. Another favorite to win was an Irish immigrant running for the U.S. team named John Lorden. By day, he was a shipping agent, and by night, he trained for competitive marathons. Lorden was coming off of a Boston Marathon victory in 1903 and was hoping to roll that momentum into an Olympic medal. However, not every runner in the 1904 Olympic Marathon was a professional competitive runner. Frederick Lors was a complete amateur who, much like John Lorden, did all of his training at night because of his day job as a bricklayer. He found his way onto the U.S. Olympic team by answering an advertisement for a special 5-mile race. His performance at this qualifier was good enough to get him onto the Olympic team, and while he did go on to win the 1905 Boston Marathon, he had virtually no competitive racing experience when he made his way to St. Louis in the summer of 1904. English immigrant Thomas Hicks ran for the American team as well, and he had some racing experience. In fact, he had even placed as high as 6th at the Boston Marathon, but was otherwise not really a compelling competitor. While it seems like most of the runners in 1904 ran under the banner of the United States, there were some notable runners from other countries as well. There was Andarin Carvajal, a 5-foot-tall mailman and extreme distance runner. He appeared at the games to represent Cuba. Carvajal came in with a bit of hype after literally running the entire length of Cuba, which is an absolutely amazing feat. He actually had to hitchhike his way to the games after losing every penny he had brought gambling in New Orleans. The most interesting competitors, however, were the 2 representatives of South Africa. They were Tswana men who were veterans of the Second Boer War, Len Tonyane and John Mashiane. Much like Philippides of yore, the 2 men were foot messengers carrying important military intel over vast stretches of land as quickly as possible. Tonyane and Mashiane were the first black Africans to compete in the modern Olympic Games. There is this incredible story here. I mean, you've got 2 men, veterans of a brutal war, breaking the modern Olympic color barrier only 2 years after British concentration camps were removed from their country. However, the 1904 Olympic Marathon would not be remembered as the event that broke the color barrier, and Len Tonyane and John Mashiane would not be remembered as heroes. From the very beginning, things were strange. The head organizer of the 1904 Games was a man named James Sullivan. Sullivan was a publisher who founded his own newspaper called the Athletic Times. He also served on the board of various amateur athletic leagues, and was even the advertising representative for Spalding, at least for a time. While his business prowess was obvious and his love for amateur sports inspiring, his skills as a planner were glaringly lacking. In the run-up to the 1904 games, Sullivan decided to organize a separate event called Anthropology Days. Now that might sound like a fun time, but what it really equated to was a living human zoo, featuring people of non-European heritage competing in games that were reflective of their culture. Tens of thousands of people gathered to watch individuals from around the world dress in caricatures of their homeland's traditional garb and participate in activities like archery, weightlifting, and tug-of-war. Those activities were officially recognized as Olympic sports in 1904. However, the participants in the Anthropology Day Games were not officially recorded, and their champions were disallowed from competing against the winners of the regular Olympic Games. Sullivan himself even stated that one of the goals of Anthropology Days was to build excitement about the real Olympic Games. Perhaps if Sullivan had spent less time planning this horribly offensive sideshow, he might have caught some of the brilliantly obvious flaws in the rest of his plans. The structure of the race was bizarre. After the starting gun fired off, the runners would have to do 5 laps around a stadium track before being led outside to run on dusty country roads, which in itself might not have been the worst thing in the world. However, race officials drove ahead and behind the runners in automobiles kicking up dust and gravel the entire time. Additionally, rather than starting in the early morning as most marathons do, this race started at 3 in the afternoon when the temperature was around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Starting in the hottest part of the day was a pretty huge oversight, but it was compounded further by Sullivan's little experiment. You see, Sullivan was an expert businessman, but a terrible scientist. He only allowed for 2 water stations to be available for the runners in a 26-mile marathon in the middle of the summer in Missouri. Maybe you're shocked by this. What could possibly inspire him to do something so stupid? Well, Sullivan wanted to conduct an experiment on a fun and exciting new theory called purposeful dehydration. This cutting-edge theory seems to be nothing more than Sullivan's attempt to cover his liability because no other experiments on the subject exist. The runners likely did not know what they were getting into when they took to the starting line. They got to position, they got set, and, at the sound of a pistol, they took off. The first runner to cross the finish line was the inexperienced amateur Frederick Loers. However, Loers would not receive a gold medal, and, in fact, the only thing he won was a year-long ban from racing. After the 9th mile, Loers began suffering from severe cramps and decided to drop out of the race. He hopped onto the back of a truck and was taken back to the stadium, waving at spectators, fans, and officials along the way. However, the truck broke down about 7 miles from the finish line, and sensing a chance to pull one over on everybody, Loers jumped down and slowly jogged to the end. He finished with a blazingly fast time, obviously, and was nearly crowned the champion before he was caught. After being caught, he insisted that it was only a joke. However, the governing body of the Amateur Athletics Union were not joking when they held up his ban. Those who gave the race an honest try were met with clouds of dust billowing from the officials' vehicles. This oversight nearly proved deadly. American runner William Garcia collapsed on the side of the road. He had inhaled so much dust that his esophagus was completely coated with it and his stomach lining had ripped. If he hadn't gotten medical attention when he did, Garcia would have bled out internally. Another victim to the dust was favorite John Lorden, who dropped out of the race as dust filled his throat and caused him to begin vomiting uncontrollably in the middle of the road. Sadly, Len Tognane was making good time and might have even placed in the race, if not for the fact that he was chased a mile off course by a feral dog. Andarin Carvajal ran an especially strange race. He ran in street clothes with his pants cut just below the knees. All along the race, he stopped to chat with spectators and even attempted to steal some of their snacks. After making off with 2 pairs, Carvajal still felt a little pang of hunger in his stomach, so when he saw some apples off the side of the road, he ran straight towards them. After scarfing down the apples, he realized that they were rotten and immediately began to feel sick. Carvajal decided to sleep off the sickness and took a nap in the orchard. Surprisingly, when he awoke, he finished the race and actually got 4th place. Some people actually argue that if he had avoided the apples, he could have won 1st place and set a new marathon record. But, by far, the strangest race was run by the actual champion, American Thomas Hicks. 10 miles from the finish line, the conditions began beating Hicks down, and it looked as if he was going to forfeit as well. When he attempted to lay down, his 2-man training team came to his side. He begged them for water, but they instead pushed a warm sponge with distilled water against his lips and urged him to continue. When this didn't get Hicks back on track, they got a little creative. The 2 trainers mixed up a concoction of strychnine and egg whites and fed it to Hicks as he ran. If you don't know what strychnine is, just know that it is a very popular rat poison. It is also highly toxic to humans. The amount needed to kill a person is very small, and the death that they experience is horrific. After ingestion, the individual's muscles lock up and spasm uncontrollably. As symptoms progress, the individual's heartbeat speeds up, their breathing gets shallow, their eyes begin to protrude from their head. Death can come within 30 minutes. So, why did Hicks' training team give him such a dangerous substance? Apparently, in small doses, strychnine can stimulate the nervous system, and the training team thought that it might just be the bump that Hicks needed to push through to the end. They were very, very wrong. The first dose of strychnine didn't seem to do much for Hicks. He was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and had been forced to breathe clouds of fine dust while running for over 2 hours. His eyes were dull. His skin was pale and clammy. His legs began to stiffen, and his jog turned into a shuffle. After hearing word of Lohr's disqualification, Hicks somehow picked up his pace and began to look a little more alive. The training team took this as a signal to dose him again, so once again, Hicks ate 2 eggs laced with strychnine. Things got very serious very quickly. Hicks began to hallucinate. As the finish line came into sight, he insisted that it was still 20 miles away. Sensing that their runner might collapse on the road, right there, the training team poured a shot of French brandy and hot tea down his throat, lifted him up on either side, and Hicks shuffled his feet in the air as if he were running, but in truth, his 2-man training crew simply carried him across the finish line. The crowd's roar faded as Thomas Hicks fell to the ground after claiming victory. He was surrounded by medical professionals who carried his limp, lifeless body away. They would struggle to save his life. Thomas Hicks had won the gold, but his body paid the price. In just 3.5 hours, he had lost 8 pounds. But he did survive. And as all of these runners did, they tried to leave this calamity in their past and move on. Thomas Hicks continued running amateur races before retiring to work as a miner in Canada. He actually became a Canadian citizen and died in Ontario at the age of 76. Frederick Lohr's won the 1905 Boston Marathon right after coming off of his year-long ban. Unfortunately, his very promising career was cut short when he was killed by pneumonia at the age of 29. Unfortunately, William Garcia, Len Tognane, and John Marchiane seemed to fade from record after the race. Andorin Carvajal was chosen to represent Cuba at the 1906 Olympic Games. However, once arriving in Italy, Carvajal disappeared. He was gone for so long that Cuban newspapers ran his obituary. But nearly a year later, he returned to Cuba on a Spanish ship and continued running until he was eventually too old to keep up with the kids. The 1904 Olympic Marathon was one of those moments in history where everything is just wrong. James Sullivan's planning was so bad that the race was almost impossible to even complete. Those who did had to reach down to the very bottom of their willpower and force themselves beyond normal human capabilities. It's a great example of circumstance dominating the narrative. There were some very interesting stories here. You've got the South African war veterans, the gambling Cuban mailman, the total amateur who made it to the Olympics after trying out in a park. There are so many interesting human moments wrapped up in this, but the race and Sullivan's ineptitude overshadow all other aspects of this wild Olympic event. Alright guys, we have reached the end of this absolutely wild tale. I hope that you enjoyed it. I know that I enjoyed doing the research for it. I mean, aside from the near-death experiences, I kind of want to see an event at the next Olympic Games turn into this kind of chaos. The only thing I can compare it to was watching Mariah Carey perform live at New Year's Eve a few years ago. That was quite chaotic, and I enjoyed every moment of it. If you liked this episode, let me know. I have been getting so much positive feedback from this new direction, and it is extremely validating, and I seriously appreciate it. You can get at me on Twitter or Instagram at Obscure History Podcast. You can also email me at obscurehistorypod@gmail.com. I am working on a new website and some new merch. If you're interested in either of those things, just keep an eye on the social channels. Also, I've got a couple of things in the works that I can't really talk about at this moment, but just know there are going to be some interesting surprises in the future. How far in the future, I cannot say, but sometime in the future, these things will happen, and I'm pretty excited about it. I am pumped to share today's indie music feature with you guys. Today we've got Nosedive by Sopwith. It's a jam. It's got a little bit of Smashing Pumpkins, a little bit of Silversun pickups, and I'm totally here for it. If you like what you hear, then look up Sopwith on your favorite music streaming service. That is Sopwith, all one word. Their work is really good, really fun, kind of like some maybe lo-fi alternative if you're into that. So anyways, tell them I sent you if you decide to go check them out. And that's it. I hope you guys have a really awesome week.